Hello class, and welcome to your Chapter 10 lecture, where we're going to be discussing collateral consequences of incarceration and reentry. As a refresher, the learning objectives for this lesson are that by the end, you should be able to evaluate the impact of collateral consequences on successful reentry, categorize collateral consequences based on offense type, and develop policy changes that would improve outcomes for those reentering society. So we'll start with Homeward. Chapter 6 looks at income, and what they found was that the median annual income within the first 12 months of the reentrants coming home was only around $6,428. That is half of the federal poverty line for a single person. Clearly, way lower than anyone could survive on or be expected to survive on or to be successful. So when we look at some of the benefits of work release, as some of the reentrant population in this study were able to partake in, we see that 1/4 were employed in a work release job, and they were then able to save a median of $2,000 by the time that they were released, versus $200 being saved by all others in the reentry study. 30% of those who were on work release were also able to hold a job 1 week post-release. And this is versus 10% of all others within the study population. So we see here that it's very important for those who are incarcerated to participate in these work release programs, because it significantly increases not only their ability to save and earn over time, but also their ability to obtain employment more readily after release. When we look at employment 1 year out within the Homeward study, we see that young men had the most serious employment problems during the reentry period, and specifically young Black men with criminal records found employment most often through formal channels versus social networks. So this is more through probation or other service programs that they were involved in, rather than through friends and family. When we look at the demographics of this population, there was half of the research study were unemployed at the 1 year mark, and 1/4 of them were never employed or never held a job. Of that quarter, 15% were white, 25% were Black, and roughly 33% were of Latino descent. So we also find that those who were able to have skilled employment had a much more powerful source of social integration. It gave them structure and pride, and also gave them a positive source of identity. We've talked about employment before and read how employment can really give individuals a sense of an increased self-esteem. It can improve their outlook on life because they feel like they're doing something, that they're being able to earn money for themselves, they're able to support themselves, so they get a sense of pride out of that. So some of the rewards of the jobs are stability, that confidence. They have more self-respect then for themselves and a greater sense of meaning, and just simply self-gratification. What's important is that some of the population were able to be or had already been union members, and they found that those who were union members tended to fare better than those who were not in the union. So in the study sample, 70 to 85% had employment versus 50% of those who were non-union members. So having these skilled labors, these skilled employment opportunities really gave individuals that ability to earn for themselves. When we look at the Ban the Box campaign, so these were actually, the Ban the Box was a huge campaign nationally, and it was passed in 2010 in Massachusetts, so just 2 years before this reentry study began. And what it did was remove the criminal history box from applications. However, what was found is that it didn't remove the stigma that was associated with having that criminal record from the employment process or the application process ever. It just simply moved it farther along in the process. So all it did was delay the employer finding out that the person had a criminal record. And the original thought was that, well, if they get to know the person a little bit, if they can simply look at who the person is, the employment experiences they've had, their skills, what they can bring to the table, and get to know them, that they would still be more likely to hire them if they later on found out that they had a criminal record. But we found out that that's not necessarily the case. Still seeing that criminal conviction, sometimes it doesn't matter what skills they have. But what we also noticed with especially this sample is that it discussed how most individuals who were reentering, who were incarcerated, had lives where even before incarceration, they didn't have stable employment. They weren't able to obtain those job skills that an employer would be looking for anyway. So it didn't necessarily help in that process. And roughly 20% of this study sample did say that their criminal history was preventing them from being hired. So what are some other factors that we have here that can impact income or the ability for one to earn? Well, we have obviously the various employment opportunities that they either have or don't have, not only depending on their criminal record, but depending on the area that they live in. We have to look at the educational level. We know that most of these respondents, most of those individuals who are incarcerated, do not have a high school diploma or a GED. And that there's physical limitations. So because these individuals, as we've discussed, have some health issues or have mental health issues, these physical limitations can also limit the types of jobs they can get, and then also limit the income that they will have per year. Having a lack of a job experience, and as always that criminal record just sort of standing there as like a stain on their applications. And then government benefits. So this population discussed how Social Security income, food stamps, some of that was very hard to obtain, but it was also very helpful when they were able to obtain these government benefits. Sometimes they lived solely off of these benefits, and other times it supplemented what little they were earning from a job. So these can be hard to obtain because of the bureaucracies of government organizations. It takes a while to fill out the forms. You have to make numerous appointments and phone calls. You have to really, really be on it to get these government benefits. They're not handed out as easily as some would have you think. And then some also talked about how reentry programs were able to help cover some or part of the expenses for maybe a short period of time. They could cover things such as electric bills, transportation, phone bills, and even give rental assistance. And these are very common types of programs that are out there that we typically offer in the probation and parole departments that will connect reentrants with to help them get back on their feet. And then race, as always, even though it shouldn't be, is a factor. And in this population, it was found that Blacks and Latinos earned roughly $5,000 less per year than their white counterparts. So if you look at the graphic on the right, it sort of just gives a breakdown of noting that the top 10% earned $28,000 or more per year, and this mostly tended to be those union members who were also mostly white older males. And that was only the top 10% of earners. Then you had the average income for those who did hold employment at roughly around $17,000 per year. Still very little money to try and live off of, especially knowing that part of this sample population had children that they should be caring for. And then they also have fines to be paying for, typically if they're on parole, supervision. And then the largest part here of your study sample, who were not employed, who had never been employed, brought in only about $6,840 each year. And that could have been a combination of from employment, from government benefits, from reentry programs, from various sources. So chapter 7 of Homeward really discussed chapter 6. So really discussed income and employment and how it's hard for individuals to be successful when they don't have the proper money coming in to support themselves. So now we're going to just talk briefly about some of the collateral consequences that being on Megan's Law or simply just having the sex offender label can have on the reentry process. So continue to think about what we talked about as far as income goes with Homeward, as we now add on, now not only is the person a reentrant, but now they have this sex offender label. So in addition to all of those collateral consequences, now they're experiencing things such as the what's been argued as the overbroad application of the sex offender label. So the sex offender label doesn't just apply to those who have had offenses that were necessarily sexual in nature. It can also be applied to those who urinate in public, statutory offenses. So these are ones in which the relationship was consensual, if not for the victim's age. This could be an individual who, as the case example in this research, he was 19 and she was 15, and he was placed on the sex offender registry for that. You can have your own opinion on whether you believe that should or should not be legal, or whether that should or should not be considered consensual. For the purposes of the law, it is considered illegal. But I would urge you to consider the fact that the age difference there is 4 years. And if you take that 4-year difference, if that individual had been over the age of 18, then that would not have been a sexual offense. And interestingly enough, non-parental kidnapping of a minor will also get someone on the sex offender registry and is actually considered a sex offense because you're taking a minor. So when we look at SORNA is your Sex Offender Registration Notification Act, and it was signed into legislation in 2006. What this does is it mandates the posting of personal information and photos of registered sex offenders online so that anyone can go on, see, typically it's the name, age, charge, what tier of sex offender they are. Are they a violent sex offender, a lower level sex offender? So they have tiers to them. They'll show you their photo, their address, date of birth. They give you a lot of demographics and identifying information. The idea is that the public is able to better protect themselves by having this information. But what we've find out and what we've realized is that it doesn't actually protect the public necessarily anymore, because the public has to actually go on and use it. The public actually has to go on then and make sure that they are looking at where these individuals live and then staying away from those individuals. And the public doesn't typically go on, the general public, I'll say, doesn't typically use that information. And then when we talk about the sex offender label, typically those who are given the label of a sex offender who have a sexual offense are placed into sex offender units. So as the case example shared in the text, he noted that he was placed on the sex offender unit when he was in prison. And he was also given a probation or a parole officer, a parole agent, who was in the sex offender unit when he was placed on parole. And typically these individuals are going to be more of your sort of old school lock 'em up type officers. The text described them as being sort of mean-spirited, which is how he saw it, because typically it takes a certain type of individual to want to or be able to work with those who are considered sex offenders. So you don't always get those who are a little bit more empathetic and caring. I'm not going to say always, because I do think there are some departments, personally in my experience, that do a very good job of placing individuals who have a treatment mindset in those units, people who can be empathetic to the person and the struggles, that the collateral consequences that they're experiencing, and help them overcome those, while also acknowledging that at times the sex offense that they've committed is quite heinous and also requires a sense of sternness from that agent officer. But the point I want to make here is that these sex offenders, no matter if they've had, statutory offenses, if it's a public urination offense, typically they'll be placed in these units when they're in prisons and on parole. So they're being, so they're forced to be around others who are sex offenders. And then we have residency restrictions for sex offenders specifically. So when we look at what this does, is it creates transience among the population. It also disrupts their ability to be stable. They can tend to be more emotionally volatile and experience more financial hardships, because when you have nowhere to lay your head at night, when you don't have a stable place to go back to, it creates a sense of uncertainty, emotionalness. So these residency restrictions, what it says is that individuals who have this type of offense cannot be within a certain distance of schools, parks, playgrounds, and typically daycare centers, which tends to force them into rural areas, or they're then forced to relocate. So if they were previously living near a school and they now have a sex offense, they now are required to move. And these rural areas tend to have limited services, limited job opportunities, and then they have a greater lack of social supports because they may be pushed farther from their families. And then when we talk about employment opportunities, they may tend to lie to employers to be able to obtain their job. They may also have harassment from coworkers when those coworkers do find out that they have that sexual offense in their history. And then jobs tend to not be flexible enough for these parolees, so that they're able to actually adhere to all of the parole conditions that they have to meet, such as treatment, home visits, coming into the office for visits. As the individual in the text described, he noted how he worked a night shift at a restaurant, but that was becoming very hard because then he wasn't able to be home when his parole agent was going to be stopping by for random check-ins. So what do we do? Think about what policy changes we could make or policies that could be in place to mitigate that situation. So yes, we want them to have employment and to work, but we also want to make sure that we're able to stop at their homes and do check-ins. So maybe we schedule them more. Maybe they can't be such randomized visits. And then when we look at these residency restrictions, sometimes they have to have, or a lot of times they have to have approval from the renting complex, or from, if it's an individual landlord, they have to notify the landlord of their offense, and that can lead to discrimination. It can lead to even neighborhood watches either being created or sort of keeping an extra eye on that offender and harassing them potentially. So what all this does is it leads to really that individual feeling quite isolated, right? So they may not want to tell their friends and their family about their sex offense. They, of course, then are not going to want to talk to their landlord about it. So they may start either pulling away from the social supports they have, or they can even be shunned by their family and friends and even their churches because of the charge that they now have. So they're now feeling isolated, rejected, and they can't live in quite a number of areas. So when they have to have these housing approvals and then notify their landlords, they're living in areas with greater levels of social disorganization then, because they don't have the options that everyone else has to choose from. And what all of this together contributes to, at times, are longer wait times for them to actually be released, because you have to wait for a home plan to be approved, typically by the paroling agency. So they have to be able to check in with whoever it is if they're going to be living with someone, or if it's a landlord, they typically need to check with that landlord, ensure that it's okay they're there. And sometimes these housing options fall through, which then forces them into local jails to await eligibility for release. A few other special conditions that sex offenders tend to have are they cannot possess a cell phone, or they cannot possess a cell phone that has an internet connection. In juvenile probation, we have a sex offender treatment program that will actually provide cell phones to kids as part of the program for those who are juvenile sex offenders. And the phone does not connect to the internet, and they can track everything that they do on it. So the only thing typically that they can do is text and receive phone calls. They also cannot possess pornography of any kind. It doesn't necessarily have to be child or illegal type of pornography, just any pornography cannot be possessed. They typically can't live in a home with children, sometimes even their own children, also family members' children. They cannot live on a block that appears to have a lot of children, and that appearance is going to be judged by the paroling authority or the parole agent. They typically are not allowed to have social media accounts or be on social media, and they can't possess photos of children, even children of their family members. Again, the example in the case study talked about how he was violated numerous times for violating these special conditions that he had, and it was because he had sexual relations, which was considered statutory sexual assault, with someone who was 15 when he was 19. So it's very easily to be violated, and these conditions are in addition to the regular parole conditions that someone is going to have. Things such as having to participate with certain treatments, curfew, possibly electronic monitoring or GPS, drug screens, reporting mandates, so how often they need to report to the office, home visits being conducted, having to have employment. All of these conditions add up to make it very difficult for one to re-enter society successful. So your book argues that why do we have these unnecessary barriers in place when research has shown that they don't necessarily reduce recidivism? Is it to make us feel better? Is it to make us feel like we're doing something, to make judges feel like they're doing something by putting all of these conditions in place, when really all you're doing is creating a bunch of barriers that really are not having the result that we intended to achieve? So we're going to wrap it up by covering the collateral consequences of punishment, a critical review and a path forward, the article that really discussed just the large scope of individuals that these collateral consequences impact, and then also the collateral consequences that they experience as a result of all this. So it's important to understand first the scope of these consequences. So 7 million US adults are in jail, prison, or under some form of community supervision. That equates to roughly 1 in 37 adults in the US. Moreover, 4.9 million have previously served time, and 19 million individuals have a felony conviction. And we know that felony convictions come along with quite a bit more collateral consequences than, say, a misdemeanor offense does. Local jails admit roughly 11 million people every single year, and 13% of all prisoners are in federal prison. So only 13% are in federal prisons. All the others are in state and local jails. Half of the federal prison population are only there for, not only, but are there for drug crimes. You would think that would be a little bit higher, a greater amount for violent offenses, but really only 7% are there for violent offenses, versus 53% of state prisoners are currently incarcerated for violent offenses. So what we see is that we have a great variation in practices across the jurisdictions, across states, and even across different counties. The big joke in Pennsylvania is that there are 63 counties and that many different ways of doing business, because we don't have a state system here that tells our probation and parole departments exactly what needs to be done and how to do it. Conditions of confinement can also differ, which can influence the magnitude and scope of the collateral consequences that are experienced. And then prisoners are typically grouped by the most recent offense, or again, if they're a sex offender, they'll typically be grouped with other sex offenders, even though there's a little evidence to show that there is widespread specialization of offenses, meaning that criminal offenders do not typically offend the exact same type of crime over and over again. I'll say the one maybe caveat to that is retail theft, but you're not typically going to put necessarily your retail theft offenders together. It's more your violent, your drug, your sex offender, maybe certain gang members they would put together for safety purposes. And then the article also talks about this idea of crimmigration, which is simply the convergence of immigration and criminal law. And if you look at the chart that the article provides, you can see that we deport roughly 300,000 non-criminal and criminal immigrants each year. And when we're detaining these either non-criminal or criminal immigrants, we're also pulling them away from their families. We're pulling them away from their communities. So they're going to experience some of the same collateral consequences that our legal criminals experience. So what are some of the collateral consequences that are discussed? Poor physical and mental health outcomes that we talked at length about last week. Declining employment prospects and future earnings. So they don't have as many employment opportunities, and they are not able to earn as much as those who have not had a criminal record. It also breaks up fragile families. So when families are already maybe experiencing some social disorganization and experiencing, low socioeconomic status, it simply breaks that up even further. Individuals cannot engage in certain civic and institutions, so they're not felony offenders are not able to vote. For institutional engagement, they're not able to apply for certain grants, like the Pell Grants for college or secondary education. There's this concept of an increase in material insecurity, so they're not able to have as many things that they may need. When we talked about sort of those transactional or supports that could be received from their social support systems. They rely more heavily on public assistance, which just raises the consequences also for taxpayers and the communities who are now funding these individuals because they're not able to obtain employment because they're not able to support themselves in meaningful ways. We talked about housing and residential instability because they're not able to afford appropriate housing, or they're not able to obtain the housing that they would like because of their criminal record. So again, certain sex offenders are not going to be accepted at certain places, or certain apartment complexes are not going to rent to them. Same with drug offenders. Once you have I believe it's a felony drug offense, you cannot apply for public housing assistance. So you can't get what's considered Section 8 housing. And then we also have poor educational and health outcomes for the children of those individuals who are incarcerated. Their parents are not there. They may be experiencing more emotional trauma, so they have poorer outcomes as well. I'd just like to throw this graphic in here because it just helps to show that this is individuals who have either a state or federal nonviolent drug conviction, all of the collateral consequences that they experience. I just want you to read through these for a minute. Of course, you have your employment, but did you also know that you can't obtain certain licensures for certain drug convictions? And this also impacts juvenile offenders. So we've had some juvenile offenders who would go to placements, and there they would be given the opportunity to obtain maybe their barber license or a nursing license. And sometimes the state, because you have to pass a state exam or a national exam, they will not give you licensure through the state if you have a drug conviction on your record. Government contracting and program participation, again, you may not be able to apply for certain Pell Grants, certain grants to obtain a higher education. That goes down into your government loans and grants. Remember, there's registration and notification residency restrictions. The ability not to be able to vote. If anyone listens to Jelly Roll, he recently gave a very good speech to Congress and mentioned how, they were discussing a bill about the fentanyl crisis. And he talked about how ironic it was that he was probably the most perfect person to be giving this speech because he had been part of the problem and now he's trying to be part of the solution. He's also someone who cannot vote as a result of his felony convictions, his drug convictions. So he's not able to vote for presidents. He's not able to vote on who should be making these policies and laws. And yet still there he is trying to convince them that this fentanyl crisis needs to be taken seriously. And you'll notice here on the left as well, the recreational licenses, which can include firearms. So for certain offenses, you will not be able to ever apply for a concealed carry permit or even be able to apply to own or possess a firearm, depending on the conviction. So what all of this ends up turning into is we start out with crime and incarceration, high rates of incarceration, actually. The U.S. is one of the leading incarcerators of criminals or of our population. That then leads into individuals who are going to be cycling in and out of the system. So we put someone in prison for a crime, they come back home into their communities, may or may not be on supervision. Maybe they're on supervision and now they violate, so they go right back into the jail system. So they keep cycling in and out, in and out. What that does is leads to a decline in neighborhood informal social controls and the idea of having a collective efficacy. Because these people are cycling in and out of the system, they're not in their communities as a presence consistently. We talked about how those older women were really sort of that stable piece in the communities, that were able to sort of be that stable person for those who are re-entering and coming back out. These individuals aren't able to do that. And the idea of collective efficacy, where when people in the community agree and have shared values, beliefs, that you have more trust within that community, then they look out for one another more. So we have a decline of that. And then it leads to an increase in cynicism of the law. So these people feel like, well, the system's against me, they're out to get me, I'm never going to be able to overcome all of this. And it leads them right back into a life of crime and incarceration. So when we have all of these collateral consequences in here, we have to keep this in mind, that we're just continuing this vicious cycle. And of course, there are some consequences, yes, that may need to be there for public safety. Yes, you do not want a child sexual predator living next to an elementary school. I believe everyone could agree on that. But when you have this overbroad application of certain things where, well, you're a criminal offender, so now just because you had a drug offense, now you can't apply for educational grants to go to college. So you've just now limited that person's ability to obtain a higher education, to learn, to grow as a person, and also to possibly earn more for them and their family. So I leave you with this summary, that a criminal record creates barriers to not only finding gainful employment, but also reduced income earnings. That work release and union membership can actually improve earning abilities and employment opportunities for reentrants. That sex offender label can create greater issues with employment, housing, social supports, earning potential, and increases the special conditions that someone has when they're under community supervision, whether it be probation or parole. Collateral consequences are going to impact not just your felony offenders, not just your drug offenders, and not just your sex offenders, but really anyone who has been incarcerated or under supervision is going to experience at least one of these collateral consequences, simply as a result of having that criminal record. And then the impact of collateral consequences is going to vary by state, county, and jurisdiction, simply because we have such varying policies in each. So that was your Week 10 lecture looking at the collateral consequences of incarceration and reentry. I hope everyone has a wonderful week.